Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Welcome everybody. Good evening. Yes, and all of you have the app, I hope. Great. So the app is not perfect, but good enough for our purposes, I hope, more or less. So we'll continue with it for the time being. Let me also open mine. So last time we came up to Shloka 57. And just to remind you a little bit of the context. What's the context? Arjuna in Shloka 54 asks a very interesting question. How does the illumined person behave? And he specifically asks about three things. How does he talk? He or she. How does he sit? Asita. So talk prabhasheta. This is 54. Sit. Asita. And vrajeta. Walk. Talk, sit, walk. Very, very sort of concrete question. He wants external signs of an illumined soul. And what is Krishna's answer? The first shloka in response, 55. It seems to be a kind of non-answer in a sense, because he doesn't explain, arguably, how the enlightened person sits, walks, talks, but rather he's talking about the internal state of the illumined soul. What is so special internally about the illumined soul? Do you remember?
He has no desires.
Yes, he has no desires. Prajahati yada kaman sarvan pathamanogatan. So most commentators take this to mean that Arjuna is barking up the wrong tree in asking for external signs of illumination. Because the real sign of an illumined soul is the heart and mind being free from all worldly desires. But there's one commentator, at least one that we're discussing in the context of this class, Sridhara Swami, who is a follower of Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta school. And he has a very interesting interpretation of 55, Krishna's whole answer, basically 55 until the end of the chapter, up to 70, 72. And he claims that there are particular shlokas where Bhagavan Krishna directly answers the three questions of Arjuna in a more literal way. And we covered one of them last time, the first one, 57. So let me just remind you briefly of what does Sridhara Swami say that Shloka 57 gives an answer to? Anybody who was here last time, do you remember? Of the three, how does the enlightened soul talk? How does he walk? And how does he sit? Yeah, which one was 57 answering according to Sridhara? Very good, exactly. Yes. How does he talk? Na abhinandati na dveshti. Because Sridhara says, abhinandati actually means rejoicing. It doesn't have to be externally expressed. But he interprets it to mean praise. And then dveshti means criticize, to engage in ninda, as a way of making 57 be an answer to Arjuna's question about how an illumined soul talks. So what are the two things left? Sitting and walking, vrajeta. So hopefully we'll see whether we can cover both of them, but eventually Sridhara Swami will interpret some other shlokas as direct answers to the other two questions. So let's now start with 58. I'll recite and please repeat after me. Shloka 58. Let me go there. Yada samharate chayam Kurmonganiva sarvashaha Indriyani Indriyarthebhyaha Tasya prajna Pratisthita. Good. Anvaya. So does everybody see the Anvaya right below the shloka? I hope. No?
What is the Anvaya?
Anvaya means a rearrangement of the words in the shloka to make the meaning of the shloka more readily understandable. So, but it should actually say Anvaya. Can you read the Hindi script? Hindi? No, so that's why. Okay, but I think that there might be a transliterated version of it. Maybe I'm wrong because there is, right? So follow the English version. That's also Anvaya, right? I hope.
Yeah, it doesn't say
Anvaya. But does it start with Yada cha kurmaha sarvashaha?
Yes.
Very good. That's the Anvaya. Good. So what we normally do is we read the shloka, then I go through this Anvaya, which means rearranging the words so that it's easier to understand the meaning, and then we discuss a little bit. So Yada means when. Yada cha kurmaha. Or actually, in this case, yada, it's more like it's an analogy being used. This is a famous analogy. It's an analogy of a tortoise. Yada cha kurmaha, a tortoise, a kurma. Sarvasha angani eva, all of its limbs. What does it do? What does a turtle do when something goes to attack it? It retracts all its limbs, right? And very quickly, and it's safe because the shell is very hard. It's a beautiful analogy. Just like that tortoise, which is able to withdraw its limbs very quickly and completely, ayam indriya arthebhyaha indriyani samharate. The illumined soul, the one who is able to withdraw his or her senses in the same way, like the tortoise, from what? Well, sense objects, right? Yeah, exactly. Objects of desire. Yeah, you don't have to whisper, you can say it. Oh, I see. Okay, that's okay. So yes. So the one who can do that, just like a tortoise withdraws its limbs, if you can also withdraw your sense organs from sense objects in that same way, in this very natural and strong way and a complete way, tasya prajna pratishtita, then we can call his or her intelligence to be firmly established, meaning we can call him or her to be a truly illumined soul. Now, there's some interesting things about this shloka. One is not just this shloka, Ramanuja. Now, so far we've read the first 4 shlokas of Bhagavan Krishna's response to Arjuna. 55, 56, 57, and now 58, right? Ramanuja claims that 55 through 58, these 4 shlokas, should be taken as 4 stages in the practice of Jnana Yoga in reverse order. So I don't want to use the word lowest practice, but the kind of foundational practice, according to him, is the one we just discussed. And then 57 describes a slightly more advanced practice. 56 then describes an even more advanced practice, culminating in the highest practice, which is Prajahati Yada Kaman, Sloka 55. And I'm not going to go through each sloka and try to analyze exactly how one is higher than the other, but I want to emphasize 58. Why does Ramanuja consider this to be the kind of beginning practice in Jnana Yoga? Jnana Yoga means the path of knowledge. In Ramanuja's philosophy, the path of knowledge consists in meditating on your true nature as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. We use an app. Do you have that app? If somebody can, it's just, you type in Aurobindo, Gita Aurobindo in your Play Store or App Store, and then you can download it. Okay. So, in what sense is it the foundational practice? In the sense that desire is still present inside. So what's the way to ultimately get rid of all your desires? You start externally. How do you start externally? This is called the practice of Dhamma. Does anyone know Dhamma? What does Dhamma mean? Sense control. Yeah, that's right, exactly. Sense control. This is part of what are called the 6 treasures in spiritual life. Shat Sampat. First, Shama. That means control of mind. We'll get back to that in a subsequent shloka, actually. It's relevant, but not right now. Dhamma is the next one, which means sense control. Control of the senses. What are the senses? Eyes, ears. You prevent the senses from going outward and becoming attached to various sense objects. That's Dhamma. Shama, by contrast, is controlling the mind. And the two are intimately linked. You cannot fully control the senses until you have fully controlled the mind. And you cannot fully control the mind until you... This is another interesting thing, but Ramanuja has a brilliant observation about this. It's coming up in a bit, but let me continue. So now, Ramanuja says that Shloka 58, it implies that you still have desire because... So, one thing I have to mention again. This is something we talked about last week, but I'm going to mention it again because it's useful for context. Shankaracharya has a great observation about Shlokas 55 to 72, Krishna's response to Arjuna. Namely that even though these are the characteristics of a realized soul, an illumined soul, they are also the characteristics of a sincere spiritual aspirant, which makes it relevant to all of us. All of us are here because we're spiritual aspirants. And so the same qualities that come spontaneously, naturally to the illumined soul, we have to work hard at cultivating as spiritual aspirants. That's the idea. So Ramanuja now is thinking about these first four shlokas, 55 to 58, from the standpoint of a spiritual aspirant. That's the thing that I wanted to mention. Now, from the standpoint of a spiritual aspirant, Shloka 58 describes a practice that is a kind of an earlier stage than 58. The reason being, in 58, the person the spiritual aspirant still has desires in his or her heart. But what you're doing is you're controlling your senses from going outward, ultimately as a means of diminishing your internal desires. And then ultimately, when you realize the highest truth, the highest reality, what happens? Then finally, all the desires of the heart are completely destroyed. Well, that comes in the very next shloka, actually. We'll get to that soon. And, okay. And why is 58 the highest? Because again, it's saying that it's at that stage that you don't have any desires at all in your heart for anything worldly. Why is desire such a bad thing? Some people ask me, especially in the West, people, what's wrong with desire? Very simple. If I desire something, it means that I'm missing something. It means I need something else to be complete. Right? If I don't have that desire, it means I'm complete even without it. If I'm addicted to cigarettes, that means I have a desire for cigarettes. What happens if I don't get a cigarette? If I'm on a plane for 20 hours, sometimes in planes from LA to Delhi or something, you get restless after 10 hours. You can't smoke on the plane, But if you don't have the addiction, then what happens? Then I don't need cigarettes, that's what you say. And the same thing. So these illumined souls say, I don't need anything from this world. What a joyous, fulfilled state. We can only imagine it. Not to need or want anything from anybody or from anything. This is Atmanyev Atmanatushtaha. That's why it's 55. Atmanyev Atmanatushtaha. You're completely contented in yourself. And here you're not self-absorbed in with lowercase s, capital S. Because you've realized your true spiritual nature. And you don't need anything outside of you. That's the idea. And okay. Why don't we move on to Shloka 59? Any questions about the tortoise shloka? Yes, please.
So
say your name first and then
Suhas.
Yeah, Suhas, thanks.
I guess I have a somewhat tangential question along the kind of analogy that you just gave us about the cigarettes. It reminded me of these Indian mystics. One, his name's
Nisargadatta Maharaj.
Him. I think also maybe Shirdi Sai Baba, but I'm not sure.
He could tell you, but go ahead. Yeah.
I think they might have had a habit of smoking cigarettes, and it's like some people kind of like question how to rationalize the.
Oh, in our tradition, we've got the same question because several of the great direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna used to smoke.
Okay.
And so one line of explanation is this is the way, this is one senior monk put it this way, and I really like this. He says, most of us as spiritual aspirants are struggling to bring our minds up from the worldly plane. But these great souls have come here not because of their own karma. They're already illumined from before they were born, actually. They come here to help others. And their mind is naturally kind of drawn up toward the state of samadhi, losing consciousness of the external world. And so they create these desires to keep their minds tethered to the worldly plane. And you can see this literally in the case of Sri Ramakrishna, because these are recorded in many places in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita in the Bengali. He'll hear one or two words of a bhajan, go into deep samadhi, totally lose external consciousness. And then after a few minutes, he says, the first thing he says, Ami jal khabo, means I want to drink some water. He has to manufacture some desire to bring the mind down from the transcendental plane. Otherwise, he may leave the body. So he's doing it out of compassion for mankind. So this is one response. But the Siddhi Sai Baba, do you have any idea of how he would respond to this kind of line of questioning?
I think
Do the people online, did you hear Suhas's question, Arya and others? Or should I repeat it? Okay, good. You can hear it. Yeah, because he had a booming voice. So yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, he used to eat meat also and all of that.
Yeah.
But at his level, it's not a matter of right or wrong or desire.
Right.
Desire, it's not out of desire he's doing.
Right.
Sort of like
Time pass or something, as the Indians say.
so there was a story of Shankara.
Yeah,
He goes with his disciples and he sees a liquor shop and drinks a pot of toddy.
right.
And then his disciples start talking among themselves, look at this guy. He asks us to follow all disciplines and he's drinking liquor.
Right.
Then he goes to the next shop, he drinks a pot of molten metal. And he says, if you can do that, you can do that.
Okay.
That's,
Okay. So if people online didn't fully hear this person's answer, he gave some examples of Siddhi Sai Baba's teachings about these things. And the main point seems to be that these people are beyond the sort of conventional right and wrong that we as spiritual aspirants should very much follow. But that once you realize God, these things become sort of much less important. Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Okay. Let's go to 59. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinaha rasavajjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate. Okay, Anvaya niraharasya. This first word is interesting. It's been interpreted in different ways. Ahara literally means, all of you who know some Indian language, can you guess? Ahara, what does it normally mean? Very good, food. Exactly. Niraharasya, somebody who abstains from eating food, would be the literal interpretation. But many commentators take it more metaphorically to mean any sense object counts as food for the sense organs. So a nirahara is somebody who abstains from indulging in sense enjoyments, basically through the five senses. Okay. So that's niraharasya. So niraharasya means this regarding the person who abstains either from indulging in sense pleasures or literally abstaining from food. Dehinaha, the embodied person. Vishayaha rasavajjam vinivattante. Vishayaha means sense objects. Rasavajjam vinivattante. Vinivattante, these sense objects. Vinivattante is been translated. It's been translated in many different ways. It's a very poetic kind of word to use in this context. But Sri Aurobindo says the objects of sense cease to affect, which I like actually. Sense objects cease to affect the person who makes it a regular spiritual practice to prevent the senses from going outward towards sense objects. But with the qualification rasavajjam. But that rasa, the taste for sense objects still remains. That desire, that internal desire still remains. So Ramanuja makes a link between 58 and 59. He's saying, how do we know that 58 is a lower practice than 57, 56, and 55? Because there's still desire. Why? Because until you have param drishtva nivattate, let me finish the anvaya, then we'll understand better. Asya rasaha api. Param drishtva nivattate. But even that taste for sense objects, that desire for sense objects, that rasaha api, even. Param drishtva, having realized the supreme reality, param drishtva, nivattate. Even that rasam, that taste, that desire for sense objects disappears. When you have realized the highest truth, the spiritual reality, whether you call that God or Atman. So why is this significant? First of all, because we should always be cautious in spiritual life and never think that I've overcome lust, overcome greed, this is because you can never fully conquer all desires until you've actually realized God. This is one very important point made in the shloka. Never become complacent, never become egotistical. There's also spiritual ego is one of the most dangerous forms of ego. So that's one. And Sri Aurobindo's commentary is pretty nice on this. So, okay, for those of you who are new to this app, bottom of the screen, second from the left, please click that. It's like a text box, and you'll find Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the shloka. Let's read it. The embodied soul, having a body, has to support it normally by food for its normal physical action. By abstention from food, it simply removes from itself the physical contact with the object of sense, but does not get rid of the inner relation which makes that contact hurtful. It retains the pleasure of the sense in the object, the rasa, the liking and disliking, raga dvesha. For rasa has two sides. So rasa, I was explaining as desire, literally it means that, but he's saying it should also include the opposite, which is dvesha. Also, disliking is it's included under rasa. That's also not good in spiritual life. Either is bad, liking and disliking. For rasa has two sides. The soul must, on the contrary, be capable of enduring the physical contact without suffering inwardly the sensuous reaction. You should be able to perceive sense objects without being affected by them, either by wanting to possess them or by feeling an aversion toward them. That's the ideal state. Then he says, otherwise there's nivritti, cessation of the object. Vishaya vinivattante. He's quoting the shloka here. But no subjective cessation, no nivritti of the mind. But the senses are of the mind, subjective, and subjective cessation of the rasa is the only real sign of mastery. We'll stop there. That's all that's necessary here. So, okay, so what is Sri Aurobindo doing? He seems to be he at least begins by taking ahara in the more literal sense, as food. And he's saying, oh, this is relevant actually. Tomorrow Shivaratri, at least for us at Hollywood Ashrama. Sunday is USC Shivaratri, will be coming, Atma Vidyananji and I. And so it's a tradition in our order to fast. And so what does it mean? Does it mean that we've completely overcome the desire for all food? No, some of us will be hungry at certain points. But you suffer through it, and you try to think of God as much as possible in those moments when you feel those pangs of hunger. That's the idea. Vishaya vinivattante niraha. That means if you're evolved to a certain point, you're not going to just, after five hours of fasting, run to the fridge and, start eating something. You can control yourself enough to refrain from having food that day on a day of fasting, upavasa. But that doesn't mean that you don't have that rasa for food, right? But the very evolved yogi, if that person fasts, he or she just won't feel any desire to eat food at all. So because it's at that level of self-mastery. Okay, and Ramanuja, he says something nice here. He says that why is it that this rasa, this taste for sense objects, ultimately disappears only after realizing the supreme truth? He says that rasa disappears because it's only then, once you realize your true nature as the eternal divine spirit, it's only then that you realize that all joy resides within the Atman, and that it's an infinitely greater joy than anything you can get from anything external. This is said in the Upanishads in many, many places. Paranchi kani vetranat swayambhus tasmat parang pashidinantaratman. Kaschit dhirav pratagatmanam aikshat avritta amritatvam ichan. Katha Upanishad. God has created our senses in such a way as to make them outward turning, outward facing. The very rare wise person is the person who is the person who is able to turn his or her eyes inward and look at perceive the soul within. And only that person attains the highest bliss and immortality. So this is also a kind of recurring theme in the Bhagavad Gita. Any questions about this shloka? Yes.
What would be a good definition of sense objects?
Any object of the five senses I don't want to be seem like I'm being a smart aleck, but is there any specific issue with that definition or?
Yeah,
or
so
doubt?
I guess I'm thinking like,
Hmm.
I think the obvious example here is food, and there's like let's say I'm addicted to sweets. That would be, an obvious comparison that I could draw. But let's say I have a desire to hold a certain profession, and it's not necessarily tied to money. Yeah. But I still have that desire to, work in a certain profession. Sure. Would that qualify as
That's a very good question. And especially, I mean, you're all students and you're eventually you'll have some kind of career, right? And we talked about this in earlier sessions, actually, but one of the key concepts in the Bhagavad Gita is swadharma. And the Gita encourages us to first discover what is our swadharma, our own law of being. What makes us tick? What kind of work is especially suited to us? But the Gita, it's not based on what do you like. It's not exactly that. The idea is, what do you feel drawn toward based on your particular set of skills, your holistic personality? What do you feel drawn toward? What are you best at? And part of the reason it says the Bhagavad Gita talks about this so much and recommends it is because it not only helps you, it helps you at a spiritual level and at the level of personal development. Because you can be the best person that you can be if you're doing the thing that brings out the best in you and that helps you to cultivate your strengths and talents, right? At the same time, there are social benefits. What are the social benefits? Because a well-functioning society is one in which each member is able to contribute the most in a way that that person is uniquely suited for. So if one person is really good at medicine, but in that society is forced to become a lawyer, that's not a well-functioning society. But if that person who's kind of naturally drawn toward medicine and has skills that are kind of innately, medicine oriented, if that person ends up becoming a doctor, that's going to be a greater benefit to society. That person will be a much better doctor, helping other people. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of your question, that was the first part of your question, was about, well, what if we get attached to the work? Is that it's not a sense object in the same sense, right? But that's also a danger. We talked about this when we were talking about the shlokas about karma yoga. And there are two things that we have to be careful. We have to be careful about when we practice karma yoga, the yoga of selfless work. One is attachment to the fruits of whatever we're doing. Fruits means what? I'm preparing for this exam. Why? Because I want to be the topper, as they say in India. I want to get name and fame. I want my professor to praise me. I want to get the best job at the best company. These are all desire for fruits. The right attitude in preparing for an exam, which may be relevant to some of you now or soon, is I want to learn as much as possible. I want to be, and do my best in this. That's not desiring fruits, right? That's the first kind of attachment that is to be avoided. Attachment to fruits. But there's a second kind of attachment, which is also dangerous. Attachment to the work itself. Why is that dangerous? Or why is that a problem in spiritual life? Because sometimes you may be in situations where you're not able to do that work. And then what happens? You'll be pining away. Why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? That means that you're overly attached to that one particular kind of work. Any kind of attachment is a form of slavery, actually. Because the moment that that thing that you're attached to is not available, you become unhappy or frustrated. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah, great. Huh? We should leave what? If what's not working?
Your work, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I don't want to give a generic answer to that. It depends. This is a case-to-case basis, right? That would be but I think the premise of Three Idiots is more or less correct. I think that you should first find out what you feel especially drawn toward. And even if your parents and society is telling you to do one thing because it's prestigious or because they desperately want you to do it, if that doesn't feel right to you, I don't see why you should do it. Anyway, I'm biased because I disobeyed my father who wanted me to study computer science. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But at the end of the day, your parents want you to be happy. And as I said, society wants you to, how do you maximally benefit society? So even if society values science, let's say, subjects over humanities, India. I just came from India. I lived there for 13 years, so I'm speaking from direct experience. Won't the society be most benefited and happier if you do the line of work that best suits you? If you love computer science, do computer science. That's a wonderful thing. But if you don't like computer science, why should you do something that makes you miserable? Or even if it's just, if you find it boring or bland, do something that really, that's your calling. Vocation means calling, actually. Something. What do you feel drawn toward? What is your calling? Okay. Any other questions before we move on? No, let's move on to Shloka 60. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramathini haranti prasabham manaha. Hey Kaunteya, oh Arjuna, Kaunteya, Krishna is saying, Pramathini Indriyani. Indriyani means senses, sense organs. The eyes, not necessarily the eyes, but the faculty of vision, faculty of hearing. Pramathini, which are constantly troubling us, harassing us, carrying us away. Yatataha vipaschitaha purushasya api. Api means even, usually, and in this context it means even. Even the purusha, the person who is vipaschitaha, a wise person, a sage, doesn't mean illumined soul, but somebody who, in Bangla, there's a very nice phrase, which I don't think there's any English equivalent, but it's wonderful. I use it frequently. Gyan papi, Jnana papi, it would be like Sanskrit and Hindi, Gyan papi, which means you know what's right, but you do the opposite. even though you know that you shouldn't be doing it. Gyan papi. Not that I'm ignorant, I don't know what I should be doing. Even that you can get, that's an excuse. But no, I know exactly what I should be doing, but I'm doing the opposite. This is Gyan papi. So this is like a Gyan papi. This is somebody who's vipaschita. This is a wise person. He or she knows what should be done. Even then, what happens? Yatataha. And this person is striving as a spiritual aspirant, really trying hard to not to think of God rather than sense objects, to think of his true nature as the Atman rather than the body-mind complex. Even then, what? The harassing senses, the vehement senses, pramathini indriyani, manaha prasabam harantihi. With great violence, the senses, the mind is carried away by the senses in a very violent way. Even in the mind of a wise person. That's the idea. Now, Ramanuja here has a really wonderful insight. You don't have to agree with it, but I like it very much. It's really interesting. He says that this shloka and the previous shloka describes a vicious cycle in spiritual life. What is the vicious cycle? I'll read his original Sanskrit commentary. It's very beautiful and simple. Evam Indriya Jaya Atma Darshana Adhina. Atma Darshanam Indriya Jaya Adhinam. Okay, I'll just parse it. Evam Indriya Jaya Atma Darshana Adhina means, okay, So Bhagavan Krishna is telling us that complete, total mastery of the senses depends on Atma Darshana, realization of our spiritual nature. Where does Bhagavan Krishna say that? The previous shloka. Rasavajam rasopyasya param drishvani vatate. What we just read. It's only when you realize the supreme truth that that taste for sense objects goes away, right? So you can't fully conquer the senses until you have realized yourself as the Atman. But at the same time, Ramanuja says, Krishna is also saying, Atma darshanam indriya jaya adhinam. You cannot fully realize the supreme until you have conquered the senses. Without sense control, who's going to be able to realize God or the self? So sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana, which is taught in all the Vedāntic traditions. You have to have viveka, you have to have vairagya, the shat sampat, the six treasures, which includes sense control, control of mind, everything. So without that, no realization of God, no realization of the Atman. So we're trapped in a vicious cycle. Do you follow what the viciousness of the cycle consists in? So you might feel helpless. What the heck do I do then? It's a lose-lose. Ramanuja says this. Bhagavan Krishna is pointing out the extreme difficulty of Jnana Yoga practiced by itself. If you just rely on your own self-effort. So what do you need? What has to come to the rescue? Can you guess? It's mentioned in the next shloka. For the first time in the Bhagavad Gita. Yes, bhakti makes its first momentous appearance. It's really interesting. So let's look at the next shloka, 61, please. Actually, before we do, let me just read Sri Aurobindo's brief commentary on the previous shloka. Yatato hyapikante. So please go to the bottom second from the left. He says, Sri Aurobindo says, certainly self-discipline, self-control is never easy. All intelligent human beings know that they must exercise some control over themselves. And nothing is more common than this advice to control the senses. But ordinarily, it is only advised imperfectly and practiced imperfectly in the most limited and insufficient fashion. By most people, ordinary people are told to control their senses. They don't do it all that well. Even, however, the sage, the man of clear, wise, and discerning soul, so the Bangla expression again, Jnanapapi, who really labors to acquire complete self-mastery, finds himself hurried and carried away by the senses. Again, this is a kind of it's cautioning spiritual aspirants. Never become complacent. Never think that I've completely conquered the lower self, conquered the ego, I'm completely free from ego. The moment you say that, Mahamaya will catch you. Now, let's go to 61. This is the shloka where Ramanuja says, this is the shloka which teaches us how to break out of this vicious cycle described in the previous shlokas. Tani sarvani sanyamya yukta asita matparaha vashehi yasyendriyani tasya prajna pratishtita. Anvaya, sarvani tani, all the senses. This is referring to indriyani, okay? Sarvani tani sanyamya, having controlled all of them. Yuktaha matparaha asita. He. The yukta, the person who is firmly established in yoga, the harmonized, the fully harmonized being. Matparaha, this is the momentous appearance of bhakti, and in a very subtle way. Because who is the mat here? What does mat mean? Me. Matparaha, paraha means intent on, with your mind completely absorbed in me, Krishna, not me, Medhananda, but Krishna. Krishna is telling Arjuna. That great yogi who has completely controlled the senses, and matparaha, whose mind is completely absorbed in God. Yasya indriyani vashe tasya prajna pratishtha. Yasya indriyani vashe, that person is the one who has his or her senses completely under control. And only then can you call that person a person of firmly established wisdom. Now, why does Ramanuja say that this shloka explains how we can break out of this vicious cycle? He says this key phrase, matparaha. Because the previous shloka is saying that, the previous two shlokas, more or less, are saying that if you just practice the yoga of knowledge, I'm just going to meditate on my true nature as the eternal soul, separate from the body-mind conflict. The moment you open your eyes and somebody talks to you and gets in a little argument with you, you lose your temper and you forget all about your soul. It's very, very difficult. That's pramatini haranti. The senses drag you away from the spiritual reality. But there's one great refuge that all of us have, which is God. Matparaha. You can rely on God from the very beginning of spiritual life. So if you can combine jnana yoga with bhakti yoga, that becomes a much more powerful and safer practice. Why? Ramanuja says, the more you think of God, matparaha, just think of God, literally think of God. However, whether that's by taking God's name, by singing bhajans, by visualizing God, by visualizing God's lila in some form of an avatara like Krishna's lila or Rama's lila, whatever it might be, but thinking of God. What happens as you contemplate God? Chitta shuddhi. Your mind and heart become purified. Gradually, it's a long process. It's a process that occurs in the course of multiple lifetimes. We believe in rebirth, Hindus. But still, slowly what happens, the more you think of God, the purer your mind becomes. And then what happens? Naturally, what happens is the purer your mind is, the better able you are to control your senses. And it's through self-control finally that, and by God's grace, that we attain self-realization or God realization. So the foundation should be bhakti. Always rely on God. If you hold on to God from the beginning, you won't get trapped in this vicious cycle of, in order to realize myself as the Atman, I have to control the senses. But in order to control the senses fully, I have to realize the self. If you just rely on your self-effort, most people, nine times out of 10, you're going to fail. You'll fall flat on your face. So better to rely on God. Take God's help. So this is Ramanuja's very interesting interpretation. I think it's very, very original and helpful in spiritual life. There are a couple other things I want to say. I promised that Sridhara would somehow interpret some of these later shlokas to be direct responses to Arjuna's question. According to Sridhara, shloka 57 already answers Arjuna's question about how an illumined person speaks. Nabhidanatina dveshti. What do you think this shloka? How do you think Sridhara interprets this shloka? There are two things left that Arjuna wants to know about. How does the illumined person sit and how does he walk? Yes, it's the same word, asita. So Sridhara pounces on asita, right? Because why same word? Because if you go back to 54, stitadi kim prabhasheta, that's covered by 57 according to Sridhara. How does the illumined person speak? Kim asita vrajeta kim asita. Asita, see? So this shloka 61 is explaining how the illumined person sits. So Sridhara seems to be taking this in a very literal way. You have to be like, I'm sitting now, we're all sitting. That's what it means. And it seems to mean, I think he's interpreting more in the sense of traditional yogic meditation, where you sit in one place in Padmasana or whatever, and close your eyes, like that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's an interesting interpretation. But there are many other interpretations. And now matparaha, this is another very controversial thing. I just mentioned that this is the first entrance of bhakti, but maybe I spoke too soon because not all commentators believe this. Shankara, for instance, he does not interpret this matparaha in terms of bhakti at all. He says, why? Well, we talked about this in an earlier class, maybe even 2 classes ago, or maybe last class. Shankara claims that shlokas 55 all the way to 72 are the characteristics of somebody who has attained Brahma Jnana, knowledge of the highest non-dual Brahman. who is supposed to be a sannyasi, all-renouncing monk, who practices only the path of knowledge, jnana yoga, because he or she is no longer an adhikari, he's not qualified to practice bhakti yoga, which is a lower discipline. That's why Shankara can't admit that any of these slokas are talking about bhakti. Because it's now, these slokas according to Shankara, are talking about the highest Advaitic realized soul, who has gone far beyond bhakti. Bhakti is a kind of lower practice for inferior spiritual aspirants who have insufficiently pure and insufficiently concentrated minds. But that can't be what the shloka is about. So what does Shankara say? He says that we should take matparaha to mean we should think of ourselves as non-different from God. It's very interesting. This Aham Brahmasmi, basically. He's like bringing the Mahavakya. Now, the question is, from the standpoint of a kind of neutral reader, is that justified? Do we find any evidence that Krishna is encouraging us in this particular shloka to think of ourselves as identical with him? Do we get that sense of Advaita or equality here? We get Paraha, but that doesn't mean Advaita. So that's a little bit tricky to justify. And there are other places we'll find where the word bhakti is used, and Shankara will interpret bhakti in the sense of jnana. And it becomes a little bit dubious. And another thing I wanted to read is, let's see how good the commentary on the app is for this one. This is not bad. Okay, this actually has most of what I want to read. So let's please go to the commentary on this one. So bottom of the screen. He's explaining it quite nicely. He says, Sri Aurobindo says, by this he means he's referring to the previous shloka, which means self-mastery, sense control. Okay, sense control cannot be done perfectly by the act of the intelligence itself, by a merely mental self-discipline. It can only be done by yoga with something which is higher than itself, and in which calm and self-mastery are inherent. And this yoga can only arrive at its success by devoting, by consecrating, by giving up the whole self to the divine, to me, says Krishna, matparaha. For the liberator is within us, the antaryami, but it is not our mind, nor our intelligence, nor our personal will. They are only instruments. It is the Lord in whom, as we are told in the end, we have utterly to take refuge. We are told in the end, the Gita, it's a very interesting text, 700 shlokas, and there's really a logical development in its ideas. And even though this is the first slightest hint of bhakti, this one small phrase, matparaha, in shloka 61 of chapter 2, bhakti becomes the keynote by the end of the Gita, and the highest teaching is sarva dharman, or before that, manmana bhavamad bhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru. Krishna says, you don't have to do anything else, just think of me constantly, be my bhakta. And then sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharam vraja, aham tva sarva papebhyo mokshishami mashucha. Abandon all other kinds of practices besides that of thinking of me. And what will happen? I will free you from all sins. You see, so instead of relying on your own self-effort, rely on God, because by God's grace, you can achieve everything. If you're trying to get to the 60th floor of a building, you could walk up the 60 flights, but if there's an elevator, why wouldn't you take the elevator? That elevator is God. Any questions for our meditation? Yes, please. Suhas?
Oh, so many. So in some commentaries of the Gita, like Prabhupada's, like it's kind of like bhakti is emphasized as like the highest practice.
Correct.
With all other ones is, I guess, kind of like the reverse of what you were just saying.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Bhakti is made into jnana.
Yeah.
Jnana is made into bhakti. Sounds like. How is that justification made? I guess
Based on the Gita or
in Prabhupada's Gita? Do you know?
Well, we'd have to look at the specific shlokas, but actually, I mean, Gita is probably one of the best scriptures. It lends itself to that kind of interpretation. I mean, arguably, Prabhupada has an easier time justifying bhakti as the highest practice than Shankara does, claiming that jnana yoga is the higher practice, just because bhakti plays such a prominent role in the Bhagavad Gita. But what we'll find in the course of the Gita is that Bhagavan Krishna tends to avoid this language of higher and lower and saying that one practice is higher than the other. Chapter 5, there are some famous shlokas. Sankhya yoga pratak balaha pravatantina panditaha. Sankhya, by which Bhagavan Krishna means in this context, the path of knowledge. And yoga here means karma yoga. Sankhya yoga pratak balaha, only idiots, fools, childish people with childish brains, think that these two paths are different and that one is higher than the other. Na panditaha, not the wise person who knows that they're just different paths to the same goal. And why even indulge in this higher-lower talk at all? So, but you're right that traditional Vedantic schools, they usually trade in this kind of language of higher and lower with respect to spiritual practices, with respect to other things too. There's a higher Brahman and lower Brahman. According to classical Advaita Vedanta, what's the higher Brahman? Non-dual, impersonal Brahman, pure consciousness. And Saguna Brahman, according to classical Advaita, Saguna Brahman means the personal God with attributes, Vishnu or whatever. They'll say, it's okay, it's good for inferior spiritual aspirants who can't think past that, who can't think about the transcendental reality. What do the bhakti schools like Vaishnavism, and what do? They flip it on its head and they say, the supreme reality, the highest reality is Krishna, the supreme person, Krishna. But where does that leave Nirguna Brahman, that thing coveted by Advaita Vedantins? That's just the Tanubha of Krishna himself. Tanubha means the peripheral brilliance of Krishna. A minor aspect of Krishna is that thing that Advaitins are talking themselves hoarse about. So they've been at loggerheads for centuries, for millennia, these different schools of representatives of different schools of Vedanta. And the tradition I belong to, which is the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, I interpret our tradition as harmonizing all these different Vedantic schools by saying, stop all this talk of higher and lower. All four of these yogas are direct and independent paths to the same goal of liberation. I don't want to plug my own tradition here, but I'm just, if you're interested in knowing where I come from, that's. And so that's also how we tend to interpret the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, and yeah, you said you had several other questions, so you can ask one more. How about one more question? And then we have a Q&A later, so you can ask.
Okay. So with Bhakti then, I guess the Bhakti theme here is directed to Saguna Brahman.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's why Shankara can't have that here. Because this sannyasi who has realized Brahman is no longer practicing bhakti.
Right.
And so he has to be saying, I'm one with Krishna as non-dual pure consciousness. That's why he's interpreting matparaha here as, I am not different from Krishna. Does that make sense now? Aham brahmasmi. Any other questions? Okay, brief meditation. So please sit comfortably, however you feel comfortable. It's called Sukhasana in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. I'll do Adda Padmasana. Now gently close your eyes. Slowly breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in all that's auspicious. Breathe out all your stresses and anxieties from this past week. Whatever thoughts, whatever feelings come up, just take a step back from them. Now focus the mind on your heart center. This is the seat of the soul, your true nature as the soul, separate from the body-mind complex. So now focus on your soul in the heart center. Think of it as a light, as an effulgent light. And I'll repeat Om slowly, and please recite it with me as you meditate on your soul. Gently open your eyes. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat.